Yeah, we're just testing it.
What makes the Balfour Declaration so important and controversial?
So last time we were talking about how Lawrence of Arabia was able to work with Aaron Aronson and with several other groups as part of the Neely spy ring to get information to General Allenby so that they could take Jerusalem, because they knew where all the wells were, they knew all the stuff. And Sarah, who is Aaron Aronson's sister, was found out because of a message they sent in a passenger pigeon, and she was captured, tortured, and killed. So you kind of want to remember her name. She's on stamps in Israel today as a commemorative thing of what she did. And she was part of this very early spy ring that provided intelligence to the British. So she is before James Bond, 007. She's providing intelligence to this whole country. They would not have had the success they had without that intelligence. So we covered this last week. I'm going to move forward. This is the path that was chosen that actually gave them great success. So it was in the summer of 1917 that Lord George had ample motive to press for a fast, moral-boosting victory. The Allied victory against the Germans, Austro-Hungarians, and Ottoman empires was continuing to produce enormous losses with little hope of a breakthrough at the Western Front. So everything was quagmired in Europe. The action was actually happening in the Middle East, because it was what in the East, in France and in Germany? Constant trench warfare. What happens to you in a trench, by the way? You rot. You get trench foot. Is the food any good? Everything's damp and wet. Sleeping accommodations are absolutely horrible. And it was just that's not where much of the action was happening. The pilots, everybody was like, I always thought it was like, I'd rather be a pilot than in the trenches. They were dying like flies because they're cloth aircraft. They hadn't even worked out all the mechanics yet of how to use a machine gun on the back of the plane without blowing your tail fin off. So there's lots of things that are going on. The British War Cabinet considered opportunities for the Near East, debating whether to make a pro-Zionist statement. General Edmund Allenby had just given command to the British forces in Egypt. In June, meeting with him for the first time, Lord George exhorted the general to deliver Jerusalem by Christmas. Allenby considered invading Palestine by marching his forces up from Egypt on the coast of Gaza and faced the same problems that had stymied his predecessor, Sir Archibald Murray, water for his troops and Gaza's daunting fortifications. So the British were like, we keep trying the same thing, to go up from Egypt, go around the coast, through Gaza to Jerusalem, and they fail, and they fail, and they fail, and they fail. And it was the Neely spy ring that gave them the right path from Beersheba going east across the map to get there. So to overcome his problems, Allenby knew that he had to find better intelligence. His best emergence was in the form of Jewish Zionist named Aaron Aronson. So he was the one who gave him this. This is a really interesting passage because he did come into Jerusalem, and it was very famous. It made world news when he was able to go in. From Isaiah, it says, can I get a reader for this one? Someone wants to take this around? Thank you, Becky. Appreciate it.
Who wants to read? World War I, Reshaping the World. Isaiah 31:4-5. For thus saith Jehovah unto me, as the lion and the young lion growling over its prey, if a multitude of shepherds be called forth against him, will not be dismayed at the voice, nor abase himself for the noise of them. So will Jehovah of hosts come down to fight upon Mount Zion and upon the hill thereof. As birds hovering, so will Jehovah of hosts protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will pass over and preserve it.
So people have been waiting a long time for this to happen, for Jerusalem to get out of the hands of the Ottomans and the Turks. It had been in their hands since 1517. Can you Just try to remember that date because it's 400 years exactly. 1517 and 1917 is the time that the Ottomans had control over that whole area. So when people say to you, oh, that Jewish problem, it's been going on forever. Is that right? Not technically. You can say, actually, the land was in Ottoman control for 400 years, where they all lived peaceably. Some of the Jews never left, and they were living peaceably with the Arabs. And it was also not until 1948, when they became a nation, that the nations decided we didn't want Jerusalem there. Didn't want the Jews returning back to the homeland. So this is a very interesting passage to think about in connection to this. I'm going to show you a video about the Balfour Declaration. People hang a lot of significance on it, and sure enough, it is. And it was brought about by a lot of key players like Ham Weissman, who gave Great Britain one of the most amazing tools ever, which was the formula of how to make acetone. So you ladies know what acetone is because you use it to take your fingernail polish off, right? We also, as men, use it for war because you can't make ammunitions without acetone. So he gave the formula to them as a chemist to turn wheat, barley, all kinds of things into acetone to make munitions. And that was part of the reason that this Balfour Declaration came around. We've heard about it all our lives as Christadelphian. The problem is that they wrote it saying, yeah, there should be a Jewish homeland, but then in the 20s, the land that they were going to give them after World War I, which included all of modern-day Jordan and Israel, just kept getting chipped away and sliced away, and it was actually Churchill who helped cut away a lot of that land and make other nations. Why would they do this? British oil interests in the Middle East, not offending the Arabs. So they just kept slicing away pieces of Israel. Then have any of you all seen the Exodus movie with Paul Newman and Eva Marie Saint? It's a great movie. It talks about the fact that all these war refugees who were in concentration camps, could they go back to Israel or Palestine? The British wouldn't let them. And then why wouldn't the British let them? There's a reason. The Arabs hated them. They didn't want it. So they put a quota on it saying, you can only let 10,000 Jews come home, when 6 million had just been killed and 3 million were trying to get home. So they put a moratorium on it. So the Jews basically had to sneak in their own people because the British would not let them in. So watch the movie The Exodus if you haven't seen it. But what I want to say about the Balfour Declaration, it says, yes, there should be a homeland, but we're not telling you what territory or when it should be done or who should go in. So it's a nice document, but it's only like a very light impression compared to what it will actually happen. It will get substantiated later. One of the greatest achievements of Zionist movement was achieving not only by the virtue of political activity, but also thanks to the importance of scientific discovery. On November the 2nd, 1917, Lionel Walter Rothschild received a historic letter. The British zoologist was a cousin of Baron Edmund James de Rothschild, who sponsored the Jewish settlement in Israel. Walter Rothschild did not carry an official role in the Zionist movement, but he was very closely associated with a close friend, and his name looks like Cham Weissman, but evidently in Hebrew is Ham Weissman. When he was president of the British Foreign Zionist Federation, in actual fact, Rothschild's work was not as an official representative of the Jews, but to deliver the famous letter on behalf of the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour. The text of the letter was approved by the British government, and among other things it says, "This Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and it was their best endeavors to facilitate and achieve this objective." So it says the British government recognizes there's a need for a national home for the Jews after World War I. The letter known as the Balfour Declaration did not surprise the Zionist movement. Such a declaration was the object of longing for decades, ever since Herzl had trying to convince the major rulers of those influenced with the hope of obtaining a charter for a Jewish settlement in Israel. So this was what sort of kicked it off after the Zionist congresses. And then I'm going to play this video. Hopefully you can hear more about it. But I can't underestimate Ham Weissman's role in all of this. He was from Eastern Europe. He was a chemist, and basically he gave this formula from how to make acetone to the British free of charge. And it saved them in the war effort all the way down. So I'm going to play this real quick.
What do Zionism and nail polish remover have in common? To answer that, let's talk about the Balfour Declaration. How did a 117-word letter from a British foreign secretary empower a 3,000-year-old nation to return to their homeland? And what makes the Balfour Declaration so important and controversial still today, more than 100 years later? November 2nd, 1917. In the thick of World War I, as the British prepared for victory over the Ottoman Empire and the imminent quest of much of the Middle East, Foreign Secretary Lord Arthur James Balfour wrote an important letter to one of Britain's most illustrious Jewish citizens, Lord Lionel Walter Rothschild. In the letter, he expressed the British government's support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This short letter would come to be known as the Balfour Declaration. We're going to see how this letter was carefully crafted, explore its deliberately ambiguous wording, and why it has been the topic of both inspiration and controversy, depending on who you ask. For many, the Balfour Declaration was the benchmark of international recognition of the Jewish right to the land of Israel. It was the first time in nearly 2,000 years that a great international power recognized the Jewish people were one nation entitled to their own land. And a few years later, after World War I, the new League of Nations, predecessor to the UN, accepted this recognition. International law now provided the Jewish people a legal right to self-determination in their homeland, something Jewish people around the world had been praying for almost 2,000 years. Others, however, viewed this as a presumptuous act of overpromising on the part of hasty British treaty makers. But let's jump back for a moment. Why was establishing a national home so important to begin with? For nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people scattered across the globe kept their dreams alive to return to their indigenous land, the land of Israel, or as the Romans had renamed it after exiling Jews, Palestina. For 2,000 years, the Jews prayed for their return to the land. They told the history of the land, they studied the civic, religious, and agricultural laws of the land, and had maintained a continuous presence in small communities throughout the land. And many Jews had returned throughout the centuries, from medieval rabbis like Judah Halevi and Nachmanides to the students of the leading 18th century scholar, the Vilna Gaon, to major waves of Jews fleeing persecution in 1881 and 1904. These latter 19th and early 20th century pioneers purchased acres of desolate swamps, desert, and soil neglected for centuries, working tirelessly to make them bloom. The prospect of international support for this cause was of utmost importance, and Herzl had desperately tried, in vain, to pitch Zionism to the Germans, the Ottomans, and the British. And though Herzl was convinced that his life's work was a failure, only 13 years after his death, the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917. But what led the European powers who had previously denied Herzl to finally approve a Jewish homeland? Well, in 1917, during World War I, as Britain was on the verge of defeating the Ottoman Turks, British leaders felt they could use a favorable boost of support. In addition to a genuine belief in the cause of Zionism, as we'll get to in a minute, Britain's leaders hoped that a statement in support of Zionism would help their cause in World War I for two primary reasons. One, the British needed help from the Russians, and knowing that many leaders of the Russian Revolution were Jewish, they hoped it would make Russia more pro-British. And two, the British hoped that supporting Zionism would help bring the Americans into the war as well.
So that's two things, please remember. So their thought was, okay, we can kill 3 birds with 1 stone. We'll get the Americans to sign on with this Balfour Declaration. The Russians want to get rid of their Jews, so this is a perfect opportunity for them to leave Russia and come down to Palestine. And the third reason was to appease the Jews, to grease the skids for all of this during wartime. So when people are developing their allies and who's going to fight with them during war, nothing is off the table. Whatever will get you there and get you your allies and help you win is possible. And that's why in wartime we see extremes that you would never see in normal peacetime, and this is one of them.
How, though? Well, the notion that Jews controlled world affairs was a well-known anti-Semitic trope, and the British weren't immune to it. But many Brits, such as Lord Balfour, also recognized the Jews' right to the land. Balfour believed that Jerusalem was more Jewish than London was British, or as Chaim Weizmann, Israel's future president, told him, "We had Jerusalem when London was just a marsh." Now, how did Chaim Weizmann come into the story? Well, Weizmann, a brilliant chemist and Zionist leader, had recently developed a new process of extracting acetone from chestnuts. What's so special about acetone? Aside from its use as nail polish remover, it was a key ingredient for the gunpowder the British Army needed in great supply. And up until the war in 1914, it was produced from minerals imported largely from Germany. But with Germany now their enemy, Britain had to find another source of large quantities of acetone, and fast. Suddenly, Weizmann's revolutionary acetone production process was in high demand, and giving the British government the rights to its development without charge, Weizmann was soon appointed director of the British Royal Navy Laboratories. Weizmann's scientific impact and position in the military industry soon brought him into working relationships with senior administration officials in London, and he became close to a young Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, and David Lloyd George, then Minister of Munitions. Weizmann's practical nature, brilliant mind, and headstrong idealism also won the support of additional key British players: Lord Balfour, Home Secretary Herbert Samuel, and expert on Turkish affairs, Sir Mark Sykes. In December 1916, Lloyd George became Prime Minister, and he named Arthur Balfour as his Foreign Secretary. Soon, the British Foreign Office sent a note to Lord Rothschild and his good friend Weizmann, requesting that they submit proposals for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This was pretty much the focus of their entire lives, so they were pretty stoked about the opportunity. In July 1917, Weizmann submitted his proposal. A few months later, the British government wrote and revised a few drafts of the declaration. Some Zionists were frustrated when the British used the phrase establishing a Jewish national homeland instead of reconstituting, which would imply they had a historical precedent for a national home there. But ultimately, it was a landmark achievement for the Zionists regardless, and the letter approved the promise the Zionist movement longed for: a recognition of the right of Jewish people to establish their national home in the land of Israel. Remember that term, a national home, because we'll come back to it later. The letter was addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild.
I'm going to stop this for the sake of time, but I just want you to understand that Chaim Weizmann's contribution, giving the formula to the British so they could win the war, because they couldn't buy acetone from Germany anymore, that was their enemy, really turned this whole thing around. The letter is strong in saying, yes, there should be a national home and it should be in Palestine, but it was also highly ambiguous because it didn't say any specifics at all. So from here, we're going to go on to the next one. And this is the San Remo Conference in 1920. Anybody heard of the San Remo Conference? Okay, this is after World War I is over. It is highly significant because this is where the Balfour Declaration got its shape. This is where, it's different from, being pregnant to actually seeing the baby in its form when it's born. This is basically when the baby is born, is the San Remo Conference of 1920, because it's not just Great Britain anymore who's recognizing the state of Israel. It's a bunch of other countries, and I have to laugh because America is an observer on this one, and they don't participate. But the International Conference in San Remo was meant to determine what should happen to the conquered lands in World War I. What agreement was signed in 1916 between all the powers? We went over this last time. Named after two guys. Sykes-Picot Agreement. So Sykes-Picot in 1916 was the French and the British saying, after the war's over, who's going to get what? Please remember the Sykes-Picot Agreement, because that one is the modern shape of the whole Middle East. You really can't understand what happened there unless you understand the Sykes-Picot Agreement. So the slicing up of the Ottoman Empire by the conquering powers included Great Britain, France, Italy, and representation from Belgium, Greece, and Japan. The conference was a continuation of the previous meeting between the Allied powers that had been in London in February of 1920, when it was decided, among other things, to put Palestine under a British mandate rule. At San Remo, the Allies confirmed the pledge containing in the Balfour Declaration concerning the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So everybody loves to talk about the Balfour Declaration, but it was loose. It was only one nation that really recognized them. Now you've got 7 international countries saying, yes, this should happen, and gave it more meat. So we're gonna watch a short video on the San Remo conference, and this is in Italy. It's a beautiful place.
It happened on April 25th, 1920. Representatives of the great powers who triumphed in World War I met in the Italian town of San Remo to divide the Middle Eastern lands they conquered. 90 years later to the day, Christians and Jews gathered on the same spot to commemorate the event. The leaders of the great powers who met here in San Remo 90 years ago are long gone, but their decisions made history and transformed the Middle East. For the first time in nearly 2
So this was done in 2010. So now it's a 103-year-old agreement.
2,000 years, they called for the establishment of a homeland for the Jewish people in an area called Palestine. Before its defeat in World War I, the 400-year-old Ottoman Empire spread throughout the Middle East. In San Remo, England, France, Italy, and Japan, along with the United States as an observer, divided the empire into 3 mandates: Iraq, Syria, and Palestine. France would oversee Syria, while Iraq and Palestine fell under Great Britain. The resolution also included the Balfour Declaration, written by England's Lord Balfour in 1917, which called for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. One English diplomat, Lord Curzon, called it Israel's Magna Carta. Thomas Sandel of the European Coalition of Israel helped organize the 90th anniversary of the signing of the San Remo Resolution.
Chaim Weizmann said at the time, you can say that Israeli state was born on the 25th of April 1920 in San Remo, because that was the significance of it.
The San Remo Resolution was the preeminent document for Jewish rights to the land of Israel.
Howard Grief, author of The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel under International Law, says the resolution established several precedents. It was adopted by the League of Nations and signed by 51 countries. Exclusive legal and political rights in Palestine went to the Jews. Well,
Okay, so I just want you to catch that. How many nations agreed to this? 51. One card short of a full deck, but it's a good number, 51. And it was also adopted by the United Nations. So the agreement internationally that the Jews should have a home and should be in Israel was agreed to by 51 countries in 1920. We're only 18 years away from, 28 years away from it actually happening. But these are the significant things about the San Remo conference I wanted you to get, so.
while those same rights in the rest of the Middle East went to the Arabs.
The Arabs got the lion's share. I mean, they got Syria, which was subsequently divided into Syria and Lebanon. They got all of Mesopotamia and all of Arabia. And this is what Balfour himself said. He said, why are you complaining? You're getting all these lands, and we're granting a niche. He called it a niche to the Jewish people who were getting at Palestine.
Grief also says the 1920 San Remo Resolution supersedes later UN resolutions.
There is such a thing in international law. Once you've recognized a certain situation and the matter is executed, you can't change it. The UN General Assembly exceeded its authority, exceeded its jurisdiction. It did not have the power to divide the country.
But what about those contested Israeli settlements in the West Bank? Many people, including the current Secretary General of the UN, say they are illegal.
Settlements are covered in Article 6 of the Mandate for Palestine, again, the legal international document of the Mandate for Palestine, and clearly says that not only the Jews have the right to settlement, that the world has the obligation to help them to settle.
This legal right of Jews to build in the West Bank or East.
Did y'all catch that? What just happened? What is he saying? The San Remo Conference was signed in 1920, way before the UN was even all set. What? 2010. Does somebody else want to raise their hand?
I think well, there's one guy's opinion
Yeah.
is that, one guy's opinion is that what was established at San Remo can't be changed forever. And the UN, all the stuff that the UN is saying is just worthless.
He's basically saying it's illegal because this was agreed to first. It predates all of it. It's like water rights out west. We agreed, the American government agreed certain Indian tribes would get a certain amount of water out of the Colorado River. And everybody tries to fight these legal battles saying Nevada, Utah, California, LA deserves this water. It's like these agreements that you made with the Indian tribes in the 1890s supersede all of y'all. So in this case, the San Remo Conference predates the UN and everything else, and people try to trump it and say, it's illegal for you to do this. It's like, no, the San Remo Conference basically says the international community should be helping the Jews build settlements. The opposite. So I just think that's pretty powerful.
Well, surely someone at the UN understands that.
Oh, that's why this is buried. Nobody wants to talk about the San Remo Conference because all these nations, there were 5 that were there. America observed as number 6 and Japan, and then it was later signed by 51 countries and adopted by the League of Nations. In the continuum of the United Nations, where does the League of Nations fall?
It was the first.
Right. It predates it completely. So I just want you to understand this because nobody's going to give credence to it. Most people won't ever have heard of San Remo, but it's there.
Is little understood in the world today. It's a situation that Thomas Sandel hopes to remedy.
We feel that we have a historical duty to just bring the facts on the table because we are here dealing with historical facts, and this should be known, this should be taken into consideration in the public debate.
Chris Mitchell, CBN News, San Remo, Italy.
So, yes, Randy.
Are the modern leaders of the world, are they trying to reinterpret that like the leaders of the United States try to reinterpret the Constitution?
Right. Yeah, it's revisionist history completely. So they either want to ignore the San Remo Conference of 1920 and the fact that 51 countries signed it, and that the League of Nations, which predates the United Nations, signed it. So what country in the United Nations has the most number of citations or movements against them? Israel. It's not China. It's not any other places like North Korea where human rights is so cheap, or anything in Africa. It's
Joe,
here.
can I
Yes.
ask you a question? In part of the video,
Mhm.
I saw that in the Balfour Declaration, they could have written that Israel would be reconstituted in that land,
Yes.
that they had a historical right to it, and they chose to not say that. What kind of impact do you think that's had on Israel's?
It's muddied the waters, and the reason why they did it was to appease the Arabs. So they didn't want to upset them. That's why the second paragraph basically says, "It will make no laws, make for any people who are already there." So it wants to appease everybody. And when this, Sykes-Picot agreement was finally implemented, they gave, and I'm going to use this term because nobody else did, they gave the Jews a slice of Swiss cheese. It's indefensible. If you look at the pockmarked map of what they gave them, it's garbage. I'm like, how are you supposed to defend this? It's like a sliver of land that goes all the way down to the Negev. And it's like, in most places, it's not more than 10 or 20 miles wide. How can you defend it? And it's all the lowland. Jordan had the high ground. And militarily, if you have the highest position, you're gonna win. All you gotta do is put your cannons and your artillery on the hill. Can I get a reader for this slide, Becky? If y'all can see it okay.
I'll do it. The British delegation to San Remo was headed by Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Lord Curzon, who had replaced Lord Balfour as Foreign Minister in 1919. Balfour, however, was also present at the conference as a consultant for final settlement issues. At both meetings, the French expressed many reservations about the inclusion of the Balfour Declaration in the peace treaty, and it was only after the exertion of British pressure that they were gradually persuaded to agree to it. The conference was also attended by Chaim Weizmann, Nahum Sokolow, and Herbert Samuel, who presented a memorandum to the British delegation on the final settlement in the Eastern Mediterranean region. The article concerning Palestine was debated on April 24th, and the next day it was finally resolved to incorporate the Balfour Declaration in Britain's mandate in Palestine. Thus, Britain was made responsible for putting into effect the declaration made on the 8th of November 1917 by the British government and adopted by the other Allied powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The resolution at San Remo was celebrated by mass rallies throughout the Jewish world.
So another way to think about the Balfour Declaration, it was written by Britain to the Jews, okay? Now, you take that little clause, that little paragraph, and you put it into the overall foreign diplomatic document and say, okay, all these nations in the Middle East plus the Balfour Declaration is now our way going forward. And you get all the nations to sign and say, this is what we all agree to, this is what's going to happen, this is the destiny of the future. But like I said, nobody talks about the San Remo Conference of 1920, and it does predate the United Nations. So this is when, I love Churchill, so it pains me to say this, but this is when the land for the Middle East that was supposed to include all of what is Israel today, plus all of Jordan, was given away, okay? So this happened in the 20s by Churchill, which I found really surprising. So he redraws the map of the Middle East and gives away 75% of Israel's land. So Churchill was certainly pro-Zionist by 1905, but find no public statement calling for an independent Israel before her actual independence in 1948. Until then, he called for a Jewish national home, believing with what cynic might calls incurable optimism that Arabs and Jews in Palestine would coexist peaceably, pointing to the benefit of the Jews had brought in the form of irrigation and horticulture. In 1921, when settling the borders of the modern Middle East, Churchill opted out for an independent Israel, but what he called a Jewish national home within Britain's Palestinian mandate, generally coinciding with what is now Israel. So instead of a nation, he's like, well, here's a home. Think of it more like a retirement home. You know, this is where we'll send you when the war is over, so that you won't be in Europe anymore. So the rest of Palestine Mandate became an Arab state to Jordan, and that was a concession to the Arabs, basically. To a delegation of Palestine Arabs in Jerusalem on 28 March 1921, Churchill declared, "It is manifestly right that the Jews who are scattered all over the world should have a national center of the national home, which some of them may put to be reunited. And where else could this trust be but in the land of Palestine, with which more than 3,000 years have been intimately, profoundly associated." So he is a Zionist. He does want them to come to the land, but then he also is the one who sort of cuts it off at the knees, saying, well, you're not going to get all this land we promised you before. Here is a map showing you what I'm talking about. So let's see if this thing works. This is what they were going to get. So I drew this little map to try to show you what they got. It's even more of a piece of Swiss cheese than this. It's pretty indefensible when this is the high ground over here. You haven't even got all the Jordan. You got this sliver of the Jordan River, and that's it. All the rest of it belongs to them. So can I get a reader for this one real quick? Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify, the San Remo, was it to give them a place to settle, or was it to give them a nation, a place that they would govern themselves?
It was to give them
a difference.
Yeah. In San Remo, I believe it was to establish a national home with the vision of them eventually becoming their own country. But it was not to give them a home, it was not to give them a nation right off the start. It was to basically appoint this land as where they would settle them.
Right, to have a home is different than to have a nation, which
Gotcha.
happens later on in 1948. So
Right.
Churchill is just continuing on what San Remo had said, right? It's
But
a place.
he took what San Remo said and greatly reduced it as a concession to the Arabs. And that's why even in San Remo, they were saying, look, you Arabs got the lion's share of what was the Ottoman Empire. If you're talking about a whole suit of clothing, Israel got a sock out of the deal. You got everything else, the waistcoat, the coat, the hat, the pants, the whole 9 yards. And they did, and it was reduced even further to this tiny sliver of land when it was all over, and it's always to try to appease the anger of the Arab states. So you want to get a reader for this one? Or shall I read it? Okay, we'll just read this one and we'll stop. On January 21st, Prime Minister Lord David George appointed Winston Churchill as colonial secretary. Churchill had been the most dynamic and controversial minister in the British wartime administrations. As First Lord of the Admiralty, he was responsible for the disastrous failure to break the Eastern Front against the Ottoman Empire in Gallipoli, which was an unimaginative plan to knock the Turks out of the war early, but did not come off during the plan, instead leading to a mass death toll of British and Commonwealth troops. However, it was also the brilliant Minister of Munitions who developed the Army tank, which tipped the balance of the Britain's favor and the end of the war. So we'll stop there, but I'll just say the Gallipoli campaign for Churchill was a disaster. Everybody thought his career was over because thousands of Australians died, New Zealanders, Canadians, and the British. So thanks for your attention. We'll pick up next time.